Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we're going to talk about motherboards. Today's goal is to talk about motherboards and do an in-depth study of motherboards. And today the topics that we're going to talk about is to once again reiterate what is a motherboard and really talk about what's also inside a motherboard. And then we'll talk about how to choose the right motherboard for you. So let's start with what is a motherboard. And I want you to recall that the motherboard is the main circuit board of a computer and has the three main functions. It allows us to connect different components of the computer. It allows us to communicate between components and also allocates power to our different components of our computer. So let's talk about the first, what a circuit board is, or what a PCB, which stands for printed circuit board. Well, it is a surface that allows the transfer and or the movement of electricity. They usually are colored green and they have these like little magnetic little lines going across, and that is the surface that where electricity travels from components to components. So our PCB also provides us different slots for our components, where our processor will go, where our memory will go, and where our expansion cards will go. And next, it'll look very thin, but there's actually single to multiple layers of PCBs that are stacked together to create a motherboard. So then we can talk about the anatomy of a motherboard, starting off with the CPU socket. In our previous video, we talked about how we must start with choosing a processor. And when we do choose a processor, we need to pick a motherboard that has a socket, that has a place that will fit the processor that we chose, and we call that the CPU socket. This is where we install our CPU. Then we have memory slots. This is where our RAM would go. Different sticks of memory will be installed into memory slots. Then throughout the motherboard, you'll see these little chips, these little components already integrated into the motherboard, which we call a chipset, which is a set of electronic components that manages the data flow between its components. And usually chipsets are rated and well reviewed, so if you get a motherboard with the best chipsets, it will be more expensive than a weaker chipset motherboard. Next, also we have non-volatile memory. This is not a hard drive. These are little memories that are integrated into the motherboard for stuff like the system's firmware and BIOS, which we'll talk about later on. Next, also we have a clock generator. There is a clock signal that helps us synchronize the components so that they all work together, so that the electrical signals flow better between the components. We have expansion slots where we are able to install expansion cards to our motherboard. Then we have power connectors so that we can connect the PCU to our motherboard. Then also we have hard drive connectors so that we can install internal hard drives connected to the motherboard. And lastly, we have I/O connectors so that we can connect our monitors, keyboard, mouse, and any other peripherals that our computer needs. So therefore, this is why the motherboard is one of the most important pieces that we have. So to look at a motherboard, this is what a motherboard looks like without any of the components. And you can see there are lots of ports, lots of things that we need to know looking at the integrated chipsets. There are heat sinks. There is a socket where our processor will go. And so all these things will come in various different sizes, and some may not come at all depending on the form factor of your motherboard. So what is a form factor? It is a specification for motherboards. It usually determines the size and the anatomy. Sometimes they'll have less slots compared to the bigger ones because we needed to shrink the size of the motherboard. So to give you the names of the common forms that we have, we start with the ATX, which is the standard size found in most computers and is considered the biggest. And we have the micro ATX, which is a bit smaller than ATX motherboards. And we go all the way down to mini ATX, which is the smallest form factor for a motherboard you can get. Then we also have to talk about CPU socket classification. This determines what CPUs can be supported by the motherboard you bought. So CPUs are classified within their families based on their architectures, and motherboards can only use CPUs that are designed for that certain family of CPU. Intel CPU require Intel-based motherboards, and AMD CPU requires AMD motherboards. And there is a gigantic list of families or CPU families, so you really have to do your research before getting your motherboard. Then we have integrated peripherals. These are extra peripherals that are built in or soldered into the motherboard. This includes disk controller so that you can install hard drives and floppy disk drives. There's also the integrated graphics controller, integrated sound controller, Ethernet network controller, USB controller, and temperature, voltage, fan speed sensors for software. So motherboards comes with lots of stuff jam-packed in, so having a great motherboard is very beneficial for your computer build. So let's talk about choosing a motherboard. So these are some factors that you want to consider when you buy a motherboard. First, the socket type. It should support your CPU. Never ever do you want to force a non-supported CPU installed into your motherboard. It will kill the motherboard, it will kill the CPU, and you wasted your money. Secondly, form factor. This should help you choose a case. Bigger than motherboard, you need a case that supports that form factor. Small motherboards, like the mini ITX motherboards, you need a case that supports that form factor. Next, memory slots. Depending on how many memory slots and what type of memory slots the motherboard has, it will help you choose how much memory and how many RAM sticks that you will need. Number of PCI slots. This should help you determine what expansion cards you want to install on your computer. And lastly, you want also to think about chipsets. This will determine the strength of your motherboard in terms of how well it does in terms of managing data flow and electric signals throughout your components. So let's talk about chipsets and firmware and BIOS. So chipset is a set of chips, electric components that are integrated onto the motherboard for more features. And these chipsets can all have various features, but the three main ones that you really want to look for is overclocking. Once again, overclocking is a feature where you can push the upper boundaries of your components. And some motherboards don't allow overclocking, where some do for purposes. SLI and crossfire support. This is where motherboards allow you to connect two same graphics card to do more powerful things with your graphics card. And if that is something that you wish to have on your computer, you want a motherboard that supports SLI or crossfire support. And next, solid state drive caching, where you do caching onto your solid state drives, and certain chipsets will not allow that, where certain chipsets or motherboards will allow that. So if you're looking into that, you need a motherboard that allows solid state drive caching. And does brand matter for motherboard? Yes, with discretion. So really what you have to ask yourself is that, and research for, is that at the time you're building your computer, you have to look at which brands offers the best for its price, which comes with the best integrated graphic, which comes with the best chipsets, and which allocates and manages the power the best. And this can be all done through review and careful research at the time when you're buying your components. So that was it. Today we talked about the in-depth study of motherboards, where we talked about what is a motherboard and how to choose the right motherboard. Thank you for watching, and stay classy.